Come see us on tour in Los Angeles, Honolulu, Dallas, Texas, Baltimore, Atlantic City, Cohoes, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets, and only there.
Let's look at some of how they get people believing all of this. And you've been speaking about this a lot. Since the attacks on New Year's Eve, we've seen a lot of things that look like transparent narrative management. They literally sent a reporter into the apartment of an alleged terrorist with chemicals sitting on the table and open Qurans. It was just, it was about as convincing as the CNN video in
where she sniffs the backpack with sarin gas. Yep.
Yeah,
That's exactly what I was thinking of. Yeah.
It was so stage managed. It was absurd. It was almost insulting. It felt like they're just not even trying anymore. So now, not long before this, you have Sean Ryan, who's former Navy SEAL, former CIA contractor. Now he's out there in the independent media. And he went on Rogan. This is back in September. And he pitched that the open borders, Al Qaeda is coming over the borders. And then he suggests that the Democrats are just doing it because they want the voters, which Joe, to his credit, saw something a little more sinister. So we're just going to look at the end of this clip.
I think it's by design, from the government, but I think that I think that the government is more incompetent than it's ever been before. And I think they have one common goal, and that I think the goal is voting. They want them to vote, but I don't think they're competent enough to realize the death and destruction and the other repercussions that we're going to face by keeping that border open. Because they don't have anybody, that they don't have anybody with any experience that they don't have any solid intelligence stuff going on that's telling them like, hey, this is what's going to happen. It's all agenda driven.
Jesus Christ.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. It does make sense that all they care about is voting, is get the people in, don't worry about the consequences. But the more insidious conspiracy would be that they want unrest, because it gives them an opportunity to clamp down on rights.
I mean, shit, though. Unrest,
He pushes right back on that.
They got really good at unrest, you know what I mean, in 2020, right? All through, or even before 2020, up to that election. So I don't think they need to import terrorism.
Yeah, but it's a different kind of unrest. The kind of unrest that you get from people blowing up Target is very different than the kind of unrest you get from a legitimate terror attack.
Yeah.
All right. So Joe's almost there, which he doesn't seem to like. He really does not want to go in that direction. So you responded to this clip. You said, please remember the history of the last 25 years and recognize this for what it is. Repackaged neocon slop brought to you by former spooks to get you to surrender your remaining freedoms in the name of fighting the war on domestic terror with consent manufactured via an American Gladio-style op using the same fucking CIA boogeymen as 2001 to 2003. All right, and lo and behold, Ryan winds up being the person who is the recipient of the Tesla bombers manifesto, and then he does this whole theatrical thing. I'm disappearing for a few days with my family because I don't know what's going to happen to me after I release this. So, but this person,
cinema.
He's presenting himself as this independent truth teller. He's on the premier platform that codes that way, right? As the independent media fighting back against the establishment. Do we actually have an independent media? How much of it is, I assume you believe he's working for the intelligence agency, Sean Ryan, as do I. How much of the independent media space do you see as really being part of that op?
So I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. Obviously, there's people that are arguably the biggest names. I think it's quite obvious that a lot of those people get sought out and bought out or willingly collaborate, or have people that once they get big enough handle their production and their shows, their guest management, and then the person that books the guest could be the spook, and then line them up with all these people that feed them stuff. I mean, it's really hard to know because, I don't have any insight to those people, including Sean Ryan, to know exactly what category he would fit in. But obviously the history of being a former CIA contractor and having active intelligence people on and just taking whatever they say as if it's absolute reality without asking for evidence or documents or anything, sort of treating all of these, currently on the payroll people, as whistleblowers without any sort of leaks or actual documentation. I think it's, that I don't think that's necessarily the right way to do that kind of reporting personally. Obviously, I'm being very nice. But I think the clip you showed is different from the one I was commenting on. The one I was commenting on is where in that same Rogan interview, he parrots this narrative that a guest on his show gave him named Sarah Adams, who's a former CIA targeting officer. Hard to know if it's really former, though, with some of these people. Right. She was basically echoing this narrative that because of the porous southern border, which again is not exclusive to the Biden administration, it's not like Trump hermetically sealed the border when he was in office, and you have several decades of this happening, whether it's Republican or Democrat. But the porous border has allowed Al Qaeda operatives to enter the U.S. and establish sleeper cells because they hate us for our freedom, guys. Remember that and how real that was. Yeah. So, that's very frustrating to me because anyone who has really done their research about the national security state or foreign wars should know that Al Qaeda is 100% a creation of intelligence services, particularly the U.S., but I would argue also with the involvement of Israel and probably the United Kingdom as well, the great triumvirate of intelligence fuckery. I think that particular narrative that's being talked about very much right now, how convenient is that? Yes. Because I have been writing for a very long time about the efforts to implement, after the war on terror, going back to the Bush era neocons, the plans on the books were also for a war on domestic terror. And every administration, Trump included, have expanded that infrastructure significantly. Every single administration since 9/11. Okay. And it's very troubling. So if you look at the Biden administration's expansion of it and how they define domestic terrorist, it includes people who oppose government overreach, people who are opposed to any form of capitalism, right? So it could be crony capitalism, it could be stakeholder capitalism. I mean, it could be any kind of, whatever they choose to define as capitalism. You don't like the current economic system, you can be considered a domestic terrorist, or you don't like a government policy you deem to be overreach. It's very vaguely defined what gets you on the naughty list. And during the previous Trump administration, basically the infrastructure for this was expanded to include what really ultimately comes down to pre-crime, but what they like to call predictive policing. And William Barr, when he was Attorney General, made this official policy of the U.S. government. And this was not reversed by Biden, and there's no indication that the incoming Trump administration plans to revert this, even though apparently they hate Bill Barr now. But he's a career CIA mop-up man, so I really doubt that. He kind of helped clean up the Epstein mess for people, didn't he? So, the war on domestic terror, to manufacture consent for that, you have to have domestic terror, just like the war on foreign terror necessitated some sort of attack to get us to go abroad. That was the push from that. So if you have a variety of domestic attacks, which is why I say a Gladio style thing, Operation Gladio, and I'm not an expert on it, so I'm going to give just a very brief overview.
Yeah, just explain that briefly for anyone who doesn't know what that was.
Yeah, so this was basically the CIA going to Europe and being like, we don't want the European governments or the Europeans to elect governments that we deem as sympathetic to the communists, i.e. Russia or whatever. And so we're going to stage terror attacks that we blame on leftist groups or groups adjacent to the political parties we don't want to win, and essentially use that to push Europeans to the right. And basically have them be, European governments be democratically elected, but manipulated into electing one certain party or one certain side of the political spectrum through terror. essentially, which is obviously very bad. And the intelligence services in Europe actually used these terror attacks as justification for something they never actually did, but they wanted to bring Operation Condor, then ongoing in South America, basically planned and run by the CIA, and then executed, of course, by the governments, the military dictatorships in South America under their control. They wanted to import that to Europe as a way to stop the terror attacks that these intelligence services were themselves creating, right? So
you're basically saying people are being manipulated into essentially voting for fascism. Right.
Well, that was essentially what Operation Gladio was. And it wasn't just the CIA, it was organized crime. It was also the Vatican. And you had these different groups coming together and contributing to that in specific ways. And you also had the involvement of the P2 Lodge in Italy, which is a very interesting rabbit hole for those interested in going down that. So basically a weird Freemason shadow government.
Well, yeah,
in
this is fucked, man.
All right, while we're down the rabbit hole, last time we were here, we had Tom O'Neill on, who wrote Chaos. And in Chaos, one of his revelations is he was doing research at the UCLA library, and he found the MK Ultra files from Gottlieb, from Jolly, from Jolly West. And one of the things he found was in their correspondence, I think this was West, saying that we have successfully learned how to erase memories. These experiments have been a success. Now, the story we always hear about MK Ultra is it was a crazy attempt to create Manchurian candidates that failed. But O'Neill's research strongly suggests it actually succeeded, and they just kept that very quiet, that they actually figured out how to do these things. When you look going back to Oswald, Timothy McVeigh, and now this most recently, where you have both of these alleged attackers from the same army base, do you think there's an MK Ultra element in these attacks?
Well, it's hard to say, but I think it's absolutely a certainty that if the CIA said, oh, we ended that program, that's not true. If it's something that helps entrench, their power and their dominance, and by the CIA, I don't necessarily just mean the agency. I mean, like, where they come from. The CIA is a product really of Wall Street and the corporations that are related. It was Wall Street lawyers.
But it was Wall Street lawyers and bankers who started the CIA.
Yeah. So, there's a huge overlap between CIA and the private sector. And now arguably the CIA has moved much more into the private sector, specifically with the advent of Silicon Valley. If you look into how many of those companies were started either like as CIA projects or by people with CIA ties or any, In-Q-Tel or anything like that, it's all pretty telling. But ultimately what I'm trying to get, as far as, the MK Ultra thing, it's very possible. The whole idea that they were trying to use torture and trauma to induce people into certain behaviors seems very likely that continues. And what better place to do that at something like a military base, especially one that's known for egregious sexual assaults, and I believe even murder of female soldiers and stuff like that were unsolved. Obviously there's violence happening there. And would that be directed? Obviously if it happened in the past, there's sort of this what I would call a misconception that the naughty things the CIA did in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and then that were outed during the Church Committee, the idea that that stopped anything, even though there was no accountability. Congress was totally stonewalled by the CIA, actually by William Barr, who was a lawyer for the CIA at the time. That was his main job at the time. Funny how these people pop up time and again. And, it doesn't mean they stopped. There's no proof they stopped. Congress just stopped investigating. And obviously it makes sense that there was a lot of pressure applied to our political system to stop that. And, But again, unfortunately, we have to be in the realm of speculation here, because it's not like any sort of evidence that would ultimately lead us to conclusively know that will ever be released to the public. So we're sort of stuck speculating, but we know that the lack of accountability of the CIA and the fact that they continue to do terrible things like they did decades ago, that all of this persists, and that the CIA definitely does regularly engage in torture, of people without due process and whatever. Would they use that to try and control people? And would they do it on our own soldiers? They experiment on U.S. soldiers all the time. People should look into these military, installations in the U.S. that are part of this defense innovation unit and all this, the sort of merging again of Silicon Valley and the military, trying to make these transhumanist soldiers and put chips in soldiers' brains so they can control drone swarms with their minds and like all the weird genetic engineering stuff. I mean, they're doing all of this to soldiers right now. So why wouldn't they? And that's like admitted. It's not like the mainstream media like reports on it, but if you look for it, it's there, So why wouldn't they, try mind control by different means, or even use those same means that allow them to control drone swarms with their brains, use that to manipulate soldiers in a different direction? I mean, they're about to be commercialized, the brain chips. So why wouldn't, they covertly use them on people?
So now
we don't know.
You've spoken a lot about how many people have reversed themselves on civil liberties, on their beliefs about the FBI. I think you've seen that really, really in sharp relief since the election. I did a whole segment about Mark Andreessen doing this whole round of calling everything that restrains.
He's Dr. Robotnik without the mustache.
He's talking about everything that restrains him is woke. So you saw this. I went to the Dissident Dialogues, which was like this IDW conference in May. And it was very eye-opening for me because it was basically pairing the anti-woke stuff, DEI and trans with, and Uyghur labor might be in your supply chain. So it was this very Jake Sullivan State Department kind of foreign policy paired with ginning up outrage about cultural issues. And we saw this deployed immediately after New Year's Eve. You have End Wokeness immediately, this big account in that space. New York City, just a few hours after a jihadist killed 15 in New Orleans. Now, this rally had been planned in advance, had nothing to do with ISIS or anything like that. But immediately they frame it as if this was to celebrate this attack in New Orleans.
I mean, after 9/11, they took an old film of Palestinians being handed candy by some like NGO and said that was Palestinians celebrating 9/11. This is an old trope. Right.
But what's new about that, although I guess this isn't really new, Nixon and Agnew presented themselves as fighting against the establishment in some way. So you wrote this, which I think sums it up pretty well, and I'd like you to elaborate on it. Some of the same prominent people who rightly have been pointing out that the FBI and CIA are deeply corrupt, which they obviously are now saying we should believe those agencies about the motives and identities of those behind the recent attacks, and also believe FBI, CIA people that the U.S. is now infiltrated and invested with Al Qaeda operatives poised to bring chaos to the U.S. in 2025. Even more odd, some of these people used to rant for hours about how Al Qaeda and ISIS were creations of the U.S. government, either directly or indirectly. Funny how narrative management works. Al Qaeda is definitely a U.S. creation, and fear over current and or future attacks will be used to market a complete techno-tyranny takeover. You'll be told the digital ID, digital surveillance money, and Palantir big data pre-crime algos are the only ways to stop the terror attacks, and it will be disturbing to see how many fall for the ruse. Don't give in to the fear and don't consent. Digital ID and many of these technologies will only stick if you voluntarily comply and adopt them. So that's a pretty terrifying future that you're describing. You're giving some prescription for how to avoid it. But yes.
I'm not trying to be terrifying. I'm trying to be realistic of the problems that can arise when you give your brain in a bag over to intelligence-linked billionaires and CIA frontmen, and where they plan overtly to take us. So, arguably there is this effort, and we saw it during COVID, for all of these quote unquote solutions to be rolled out that had nothing to do with viral infections. And arguably, things like vaccine passports had nothing to do with whether you were, it wasn't really based on public health policy. It was arguably a trial run for digital ID infrastructure, which is meant to be applied to health, among other things. And then things like the pre-crime algorithms of Palantir have been in testing for a long time. Predictive policing specifically, mainly in minority dominant communities in New Orleans and Los Angeles. Very biased, very messed up algorithms, but they were also used to distribute, vaccines during the COVID era and decided which communities need the most, and then pushed those vaccines to the same minorities that they have targeted previously through predictive policing and ICE and things like that. Digital IDs, are advancing rapidly, including from people that claim to be against vaccine passports and all this stuff during COVID, like Ron DeSantis, for example. Florida is advancing very quickly to the digital driver's license world, the Florida Smart ID card, and all of this. And so arguably really the only difference is the sales pitch at this point. So, I've argued for, well over a year now that they saw resistance to it the way it was being pitched during the COVID era. And so because ultimately we are governed and ruled by a public-private partnership, they move it out of the public sector and more into the private sector, left to right. It's the same type of ping pong. And so ultimately, now the sales pitch is going to be meant to appeal to the demographic that complained the most about that, right-leaning Americans, right. Give them a sales pitch that they're more likely to swallow. So that would be, this is the solution to crime, rampant crime. This is the solution to illegal immigration. And what better way to push that even further on over than arguing, having this sort of milieu of all these ISIS, Al Qaeda terror attacks, blame that on the border and be like, well, we need to know who everyone is that's coming in or out, which is already a policy Trump campaigned on this cycle, the very precise biometric entry-exit tracking system, he called it. And that's, essentially a recipe for a digital ID, not just for the border, but all ports of entry. And TSA has been moving in this direction for some time, and that clear private sector equivalent, in airport security has been there to sort of normalize the whole biometric stuff. And it's really ultimately part of this global plan that's part of Interpol, that every country in the world has basically agreed to the implementation of what Interpol calls the global policing goals, which a lot of people, I would recommend you should read about those. They're rather interesting. And, if they keep pushing this narrative enough about Al Qaeda, for example, we need to go after terror financing. Well, now we need visibility into every dollar spent everywhere in the country. And you can then sell, a digital, cashless, surveillable, programmable even society. With pre-crime, the ultimate goal of total information awareness, the DARPA program that Palantir repackaged as a private sector thing, the goal of that was to stop terror attacks before it happened. But then they also wanted to apply that to stop pandemics before they happen. There was this multi-tier goal, you could argue, and the anthrax attacks right after 9/11 were all part of this. Actually, it was intended with the anthrax attacks to have multiple bioterror events happen after that. But lo and behold, the anthrax was traced back to a U.S. military before they could convince everyone that it had actually come from Iraq. And so that operation kind of got folded, but you can see that that was ultimately the plan. And so if this narrative is sort of about Al Qaeda sleeper cells being activated or whatever, is sort of predictive programming for some sort of American Gladio thing, which I certainly hope it is not. But if it is, the goal is to have people so scared and so freaked out and feel so insecure that they'll be willing to trade their remaining liberties and freedom for that. And ultimately, a lot of these things, particularly digital ID, are really the linchpin in leading us into this digital transformation era that has a lot of names, that some of them turn people off, like the Great Reset and whatever. But ultimately, the goal is to lead people into this fourth industrial revolution, which is basically sort of this post-human future where AI basically runs everything and the tech overlords rule over us. And they're trying to convince a lot of people right now that they will be benevolent overlords, and they're so cool, and they're anti-woke, like you pointed out earlier. It's kind of funny, like Elon Musk basically like pisses off a huge amount of what he has cultivated as his base, Trump's base basically, and then is like, well, I'll just come back and make memes and talk about how I'm going to reach level 80 in the Path of Exile video game. And, maybe tomorrow I'll tweet about how Disney turned a beloved character into a different race, and then they'll be back in my corner again. I mean, it's very easy for these people to play you, and they've been doing it for years. But they have... Yeah,
I don't know how much you've been online the last couple of days, but no sooner did they start to lose the love of the peasants, they started really asking questions about these New Year's Eve attacks and how weird a lot of the surrounding incidents, like the reporter walking through the apartment were. And all of a sudden, and I'm not saying the story is not true, but anyone who really looks into these kinds of things knows about these grooming gangs in England. This is This is not a new story.
Right.
All of a sudden, in the last 24 hours, oh my God, this is what we need to be obsessed with right now. And
nobody's going to give me shit
Elon
for
has
going
like
after
10
rape
tweets
gangs,
about
so I may
this
as well
today.
do that. Yeah, right. Nobody's going to give me shit for that, right? That's something.
Right.
Well,
who's going to come at me for that?
what about the pedo grooming gang that was run by Israel in the U.S.?
Yeah.
Well,
they're not mentioning that.
No,
but I mean,
won't.
so it sounds like the upshot here is that they're basically 10 steps ahead of the public, and the public has no idea whatsoever. Right. Because the other thing, and this is what always, you're a wealth of knowledge on this. I'm obviously not, but intuitively, I just could not help but recoil when people said in the run up to the presidential vote, and I didn't vote for either of the major candidates, so I'm not here to advocate for one or the other or really compare them. But the idea that we had to elect Trump to save the country just seemed absurd on its face. It seemed absolutely absurd because of this. Because now you have, intuitively, you could just sense the merger of not only capital with the state, but tech capital with the state. I mean, and to go back to what we talked to at the beginning of the interview, a streamlined government, not only is it not necessarily a smaller government, it can very easily become a larger government.
And less efficient if the algorithms don't work.
Well, that too, but also like once that infrastructure is there, let's say the pendulum swings and someone who wants to greatly expand government power, who says that outright, the tools are all there for them to do that.
There, indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Come see us on tour in Los Angeles, Honolulu, Dallas, Texas, Baltimore, Atlantic City, Cohoes, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets, and only there.